Hello and welcome to Buzz Corner. My name is Andrea Holcomb.
Hi, everybody. I am Bucky.
And today's topic with our guest, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Daniel, and my sign name is a D in front of my I, Daniel Israilov. And I just have to say thank you for giving me this opportunity and this platform to have this discussion.
Oh, it's all good.
You know, throughout my experience, I have Russian Sign Language, I have Israeli Sign Language, I have American Sign Language, and internationally, I have just sort of taken many various cultures and experiences to sort of put me where I am now. And a few years back, you know, when I anticipated moving here, I sort of envisioned a very seamless experience in terms of communication and interpreting access. But upon arriving, despite being very excited, what I've seen is that throughout the States, is that interpreters, regardless of where you are countrywide, and people in general, you know, that a lot of people do recognize and utilize gesture, which is fantastic. As far as video remote services all over the country, that's great in terms of access. But one of the things that I've noticed sort of just everywhere is that as I have tried to use gesture and to communicate, I have encountered some various frustrations amongst my friends in the deaf community. Gesture doesn't quite come across. And in terms of individuals who are familiar with like a visual vernacular, things have gotten kind of obvious over the course of time that I've been here. And one of the things that I've noticed is that facial expression is absent, which impacts the communication and clarity of sign language. And two things rather, that I've noticed is that there is a lack of facial expression and a lack of classifier usage. And that raises the question as to why. Why are classifiers and particularly facial expressions not being used amongst interpreters?
Well, I would think it would be from not spending enough time actually authentically learning the language from deaf people. When you learn a language like that in a book, you know, we have students in interpreter training programs looking at 2D images of still pictures, trying to learn a 3D language.
And to add to Bucky's point, Korean culture doesn't really involve the use of much facial expression. So I think that maybe that's the difficulty interpreters are experiencing, right? Absolutely.
Specifically American culture.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and that might be part of it. But, you know, looking at not having ASL as their first language, we can understand that. However, you see many people in their time learning how to sign, and over time, they become more affluent and the actual sign component is clear. However, the facial expression is lacking. So classifiers and facial expressions are so critical. You know, if I can offer a comparison as an individual who is speaking, the others who may be listening to that person are gleaning emotion. So for example, if your pitch is high, you may be upset, you may be angry, or if it's low, etc. All of that has meaning as your voice, whether it's scratchy, if it's tense, if it sort of fluctuates, all of that has meaning embedded in that sound. And so essentially you look at facial expression, and that is the equivalent in ASL. It conveys meaning. And so without it, it fails to allow a person to offer a complete representation of what they're attempting to communicate. So as an example, you may have an interpreter who's providing a service in a particular situation, right? And they're signing this, which is the door was loud. And, you know, I'm a deaf individual, okay? And I see the sign loud, and I may not really be able to understand fully what that means. I'm not really able to picture what it means. So as opposed to just signing door and loud, maybe you use the facial expression to indicate that it was a slam, or the opposite. It closed quietly. You see how facial expression clarified that?
Yes.
Mhm.
and how simple it can be. So the visual elements with the classifiers make communication much more concise rather than adding all of these strenuous signs or using adjectives like very. Just use the facial expression in the non-manuals.
So that makes me think that in America, we have such an ingrained value of English. It's so ingrained in multiple systems in our country. And obviously, it's also ideologically based. So when you have somebody that's signing that the door was loud, that puts even more emphasis on the ear, that it's a sound that it's coming from. That's a really good point, that is a hearing view of that experience, instead of taking that into a deaf perspective and using what that would look like and how that would be portrayed, that actually gives you that information. So what I'm wondering after that conversation is, do you think that this is specifically a phenomenon you're seeing in the American interpreters missing this, or are you seeing that in other interpreters in other sign languages in other countries?
So, for example, in Italy, the interpreters there have a very strong use of facial expressions. In Israel, they also utilize facial expressions. However, in Germany, not so much. Also in Russia, in China and Japan, also there isn't much facial expression. And I think a reason for that could be in potential embarrassment, like they don't want to draw any attention to themselves, and so they don't want to put on any facial expressions. The other possibility is boundaries and expressing emotions.
Mm.
Go ahead, Andrea. You were going to make a comment?
No, please continue.
So one of the fantastic things about ASL in terms of storytelling and creativity, like alphabet-based storytelling, it's here in America, it's quite profound. However, again, hearing interpreters and hearing signers are missing the facial expression element of it. And over time, it's sort of become the norm. And so what I've noticed is that hearing individuals, they sort of link their minds in terms of a sign or a concept. And so they develop this habit of automatically deferring to a specific sign, whereas they don't really embed the non-manuals, the classifiers, and the facial expressions that are already embedded. Deaf individuals do this inherently.
And you know what? That actually makes me think of other countries and the cultures compared to American culture, right? Where here in America, interpreters might not necessarily practice their facial expression nearly as much, right? Where they don't have that same opportunity to go ahead and play the signs in the way that children do, right? They can explore their signs, explore their expressions. Interpreters don't really have that opportunity to go ahead and play to the same level that other children do in their adulthood. So I think that it might be more difficult for them to really embrace that inner signing child, if you will, to go ahead and use that full range of sign and expression. Right. And again, within hearing culture, they typically have a more passive space in their communications. They don't embrace that use of facial expression. So I'm thinking that those are the two things that I'm really seeing that interpreters really lack.
Yes, right. And give me a moment. Let me just take a look at my notes here. But to respond, that's absolutely right, what you were just talking about as far as hearing individuals are concerned. And this is most, this doesn't apply to all, but like, for example, you have coda interpreters who use, their visual and their facial expressions, and they match it quite well. But there are other individuals, and again, looking at codas who grew up with this, it's quite easy to see it, but they may not, the answer to this may be that there's not enough exposure, there's not enough practice using this, right? And the other thing too is, when you have an individual who's using ASL that you can really connect with, and you communicate. However, if you're signing with somebody who is using a similar version or signs language, then it becomes a lot more difficult. And so, for example, not utilizing the facial expressions, whether it's just a lazy or an inadvertent attempt to not utilize it. But again, facial expression really affects communication intently.
So go ahead, please.
Yeah, I do think that it's very clear that deaf people want interpreters to improve their skills, including facial expressions. And that is part of the culture. We've talked about other languages in China and Germany that some of those cultures, specifically in their hearing culture, would have a very, very plain facial expression, but we really have to break that mode and transfer into a visual language for the deaf consumers. So how can we get hearing interpreters to break that embarrassment or that professional boundary that they feel like they have to present, and to provide better services by incorporating those visual cues? How can we get them through that point?
There's a lot of things to consider, right? So think about professors in ITPs across the country, right? Having strong deaf representation there where they're utilizing facial expressions and not relying so much on finger spelling. Finger spelling doesn't necessarily have embedded facial expression, right? And that's going to continue to contribute to the problem.
True.
And so, in terms of names and addresses, particularly large words, finger spelling is definitely okay. Looking at courses that involve classifier use or hand shapes or gesture, that way it becomes a more natural process of using it for interpreters.
Uh-huh.
And just including various deaf individuals of various cognitive abilities, not just sort of a cookie cutter deaf experience, right? We need interpreters to be exposed to situations that vary in difficulty and be afforded the opportunity to fail and get back up and try again. Another possibility is, a lot more practical application as opposed to theory, right? There's a lot of theory that happens within education, but really there's a necessity for more hands-up practice and application. Another thought is having international conferences, Ireland and Norway and various countries being involved so that there is just all sorts of communication that's different, but yet will still rely on facial expressions to sort of make people think outside the box. And you think about two hearing individuals from two different countries that can come together. And the question is can they communicate visually or gesturally?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. I think deaf folks could.
You're right, deaf could.
Yes, right. Two hearing people get together and they don't really have that ability, right? They follow that cognitive train of thought that is something that adheres to their respective cultures and languages, right? But this is an element where we have to think outside the box, right? And so classifiers and facial expression is something that deaf individuals, they use internationally. And it's not something that interpreters can just decide not to use.
So a point that I'd like to bring up related to fingerspelling is here in America, we fingerspell a lot. Case in point, the word bank, right? Fingerspell the word bank. We don't have a sign for it. We use the sign for store, but at the same point, right, we could simply use two different signs to convey that same meaning, right? Buying and grocery. Something that we have to keep in mind is the use of C and how hearing individuals started joining us as a part of their education, right? And they started fingerspelling. Do they emphasize that equally in other countries? So we have to consider interpreters in other countries might focus less on fingerspelling and more on facial expression. And so here we think that perhaps we need to focus on less initialization and using additional ASL modalities, facial expression, increasingly, right? I mean, no question. I think that we definitely need to go ahead and do that, but I'm not sure that we talk about that.
Yeah, so one thing I've noted in the United States is, you see a lot of finger spelling initialized signing, like for Florida, FLA. Texas has a sign that's pretty widely used. California has a sign that's widely used, but a lot of states are finger spelled, NYC, New York City, right?
Minnesota.
Right. So a lot of stuff is finger spelled. However, in other places, there are signs for all of those names. There is no finger spelling to represent that. Finger spelling is good, right? It's a representation of how to represent words in a written format, but at the same time, you have to have some flexibility. You can still utilize finger spelling with the use of non-manual markers and facial expression. So, I have an example here. So here's just something to think about. So if you have an interpreter that signed, you know, I took this, finished, I got certified, you know, hats off, and that's great. And they have this certification that they have. But the question is that certification sufficient? And so, for example, let's say I want to study to become a doctor. So I'm engaged in that study. It's typically 7 years of study and an additional 4 years beyond that. And this is just surface level, right? That's just the body. And then beyond learning about the body, they get into their specialties, right? Maybe it's cardiac, surgeon, et cetera. Maybe it's an eye doctor, right? You have to think about that in concepts of how we look at interpreters, right? So we learn, and then after that, we take, for example, facial expression, and we learn that even more intently. So as an example, most interpreters, you know, they sign in an English-like format, right? So a doctor may come in and they may sign something like, hey, the doctor said that your blood pressure is very high or very low. You know, the question is how can you represent that much more visually or gesturally? I'm challenging the two of you. Give it a try. Just give it a try.
Okay. Okay.
You know, this isn't a test.
You're not going to give me an S? No failing today?
Come on, give it a try. Give it a try.
So I'd try and show that the blood going through the arm with the cuff on it, and maybe show it elevated rather than using a visual sign or a sign for high.
So I'd probably start the same as you, but I'd emphasize the heart and
That was
the pressures within
good.
the heart being elevated.
Both of those were great options. And that's an indication that there are many different ways. It's not about right and wrong, but it's about using the visual elements embedded in ASL, right? Facial expression is universal. So look here, you know, I'm using the cuff, and now I'm showing the needle, and now I'm showing that the heart is really racing, right? Or as opposed to that, I might show that the heart is moving very slow and the needle is going in the opposite direction, indicating low blood pressure. This
That's
is
super clear.
very accessible for deaf individuals.
Yeah, because in real life, there's that gauge with a needle on it, so you can see the numbers rising. So your example is very easy to follow.
Right? Instead of just using the physical signs of low and high. So for example, nerves. How might you sign nerves?
Honestly, I think that nerves would be really hard to conceptualize because you have to be very, very visual with your representation, right? I can show you something running up my arm, so I don't think that's sufficient. Bucky, what do you think about this sound?
I want to think it's something sending, like from where the pain is going from that location up to my brain for that to register. It doesn't have to do with the bones though. So just trying to show how that communication happens.
Very good. That was great. Both of you offered a fantastic example. So you just mentioned, I saw your non-manual there. You used this on your mouth, right? And that's great. So you've got your hands and that's going up, you know, and it's indicating a flow. But as far as blood pressure, but nerves have a different kind of movement, right? So if you
in the case
bump,
of pain, right?
yeah, if you bang your elbow, right, you might represent that differently. So here you see this constant sign for nerves, but the question is that really an appropriate sign in this case? Not really. So for example, you know, if you're indicating maybe the right knee or the right leg, you might use the hands there to indicate the sensation that's being experienced, and that within itself explains the nerves.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so speaking for myself, right? So I work with adults with developmental disabilities, language deprivation, lack of reading and writing skills, lack of sign language. And focusing particularly on the CDI population, we already have a dearth, right? But at the same time, who are those folks that they're typically interacting? Hearing interpreters, right? So that kind of visual representation is incredibly important in a medical setting. So how can interpreters improve those skills?
So like I've mentioned, in engaging in workshops and training, right? Hands up practice as opposed to just theory, you know, having more workshops about visual vernacular. You know, that it would be great. Visual vernacular specifically for the medical field, how to utilize the hands to communicate intricate thoughts as opposed to just finger spelling or signing things. Having students, amongst 300 students, out of them, over 100 of them, you know, they had engaged in medical interpreting for over 25 years. 100 of those students were just shocked that they could utilize more facial expression as opposed to just finger spelling the concepts that they hear. And some interpreters between 5 to 10 years of interpreting experience did indicate that they had weak utilization of facial expression. Codas particularly indicated that people had given them the feedback that their facial expression was over the top, and so they began to diminish using it. Over time, many interpreters have indicated that they had not used it, and just over time, you know, they just weren't using it because perhaps some of the deaf consumers that they were working with were also not using it, and so it's a matter of exposure. So we just have to teach how to use facial expression.
Yeah, I know that I've gone to a lot of interpreting workshops and flown all over the country for different conferences. And you're absolutely right. A lot of them, there's really two different kinds. There's the theory-based workshops, and there's all of that that's very cognitive and talks about our processing and all of that very meta stuff. And then there's the actual practical stuff that's related to physically interpreting. And that's typically how to sign better, though. That's typically vocabulary type of workshops. So I've seen a few that are outliers that really do focus on more hard skills, but I don't think that I've seen very many of this particular type of workshop focusing on these specific skills of the language and not just adding on a supplemental tag to their skill set, but actually supplementing their language skills.
Yes.
I think that we really need more of that.
That's right. You know, just as a comparison, you know, individuals who may be writing and you're reading what it is that they're writing and you're looking at those specific words. And if you do not know that word, it's not in your word bank, you look at the context, what was written before and after, and then you can piece together the meaning. It's the same concept with facial expression, same concept, you know, as opposed to just finger spelling things. Most interpreters, including certified deaf interpreters who are watching these interpreters, you know, without the facial expression, it's difficult to ascertain if you're telling, like if you're giving a command or if you're asking a question, right?
Oh, that's frustrating.
Yes, it is.
You know, and that is the experience. But I have to say, I have to commend interpreters in general for rolling up their sleeves and always working on improving their skills. But we really have to take a look at embedding and incorporating facial expression and non-manual markers in the work.
So I think that most interpreters are probably unaware, honestly. You mentioned that there are interpreter programs, and most of them are run by hearing interpreters. Right, yes, the teachers are hearing.
Oh.
There are a few out there that would have deaf professors or deaf people running them, yes, but the vast majority are run by hearing people. So when students are in those programs, they're looking at a hearing interpreter modeling the language that's going to focus on the vocabulary and the physical signs being put together and less on these other new intricate parts of the language. And if they're learning it from somebody who didn't learn it, they aren't going to learn it. So there's a lot more focus on translating the exact word correctly and getting the correct word out there, trying to rework the language into a different code, but it doesn't focus on the actual visual nuance of meaning that comes behind. And so that's a real high need that I would see in interpreter programs. And I like that idea of such as a miming class or a gestural class.
And you know, I've got two things that come to mind, right? Is that I actually took a gesturing class, a Gallaudet. And when I took that, I didn't grow up. I grew up in a hearing family. It's not the same as someone who might have grown up deaf in a deaf family. So really, for me, I learned a lot in that class. And what's great about that class is that there's zero reliance on any kind of sign, but 100% gesture, right? Imagine you have to go to another country this is the kind of dressing you might have to go ahead and do. So imagine getting used to that, right? So to go from signing and fingerspelling to go to 100% gesturing, that was something else. Also, when you consider interpreters and their visibility on media in all of their ways, right? Hearing people might go ahead and mock their use of facial expression, right? Calling them excessively expressive, but at the same time, that is an absolutely integral component of ASL. But again, what you might go ahead and see is that lack of commonality with interpreters using that full range of facial expression, right? Because those that do become viral and not necessarily for the right reason.
Right, exactly. Everyone's, oh, like, look at the tongue on that sign. And then the hearing people, the interpreters, are going to backtrack and put that away and hide.
Yes.
Right. You know, that the environment is impacting them and they're feeling targeted or singled out. And so they don't use the facial expression as a result of that. There's not enough support or recognition or understanding of what their role is in utilizing expression in that role.
And I'm trying to think of the very first modern viral interpreter, right? I think that was Lydia, right? Lydia had perfectly fine facial expression, but during the course of the interview, they kept harping on her use of facial expression to the point where they draw attention to her when other interpreters do the same, right? So then with that first exposure, I think that really opens up this conversation to facial expression and its use, where interpreters really need to fully internalize the use of facial expression and get rid of those feelings of shame.
You know, let's just think about this. If hearing individuals really utilized fingerspelling, right? Or excuse me, gesture and really embedded it into their work, right? Then it wouldn't be such a phenomenon when it happens. You know, you recognize how clear the message in when it's being utilized. And sort of ironically, just something that I've done, I've sort of surveyed and taken a look around, looking at interpreters and interpreters on BRS, you know, I'll ask, you know, this sign, I on the palm, and I'll ask, and they don't know what word I'm specifically looking for. And so essentially I see their tag, or excuse me, a card with a face on it. And so then I'll ask, you know, what does that mean? You know, the card with the face on it. You can explain ID that way, right? So it's different ways of explaining. Instead of an identification card, you can say card with the face on it, you know, and then looking at numbers, and I might sign 1, 9, 7, 5, but using two hands. And so they get really confused because they're used to one digit sign or one hand signed in ASL, right? Because they already know those signs for numbers. Deaf people can catch that much more quickly, but interpreters, like for example, international, you know, they may not be able to pick up on that as adeptly. So that's something I also cover in my class, just looking at representation and gestures. You get so used to numbers with only one hand that it's sort of like an automatic mental process instead of a cognitive process that requires them to think.
And, you know, speaking of deaf people all over the world, we all share facial expression. We all have that shared experience, right? No matter where we sign, we have similar facial expression, right? That's just something that all deaf people do have. And even today, interpreters struggle with that.
Right. But, you know, the reason for that is, you know, internationally, right? They've got standards for medicine, you know, surgery protocol. It's the same. And how they do that is they convene, they have these conferences, they discuss things. No such conference exists for hearing interpreters to come together, right? Things are different all over the place. And really, we have to think about standardization internationally, worldwide. There's not any communication on that. And so now looking at deaf individuals all over the world, it's just so natural. It's just, And codas, for many codas as well, that facial expression element is so natural. So as an example, if you have, there's a limited number of facial expressions, but classifiers are unlimited. Look at this. Look at how my non-manual can be used for all of these different classifiers. A door closing, a gunshot, a ball or a rock falling, right? You see all of that? Facial expressions aren't really tough to learn. There's a finite number of facial expressions and you can learn them. There's a definite number, as opposed to classifiers would take much, much longer to learn the various hand shapes that may represent what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, I think Gabrielle, I think, has their hand up and has been trying for a long time. Their shoulder's probably getting sore. Why don't we have them come up and ask that question?
That's right. Come on up.
And participants, if there's anybody else that wants to comment or ask a question, please feel free to hit that raise hand button. Gabrielle should be here. Okay.
All right, and hello everyone. I'm Gabrielle, and this is my plan. Thank you all so much, Linguabee, for hosting this discussion with Daniel. I've seen several of your performances, and I apologize for not recalling your name immediately. So I think it's very important, this discussion on facial expression, right? And how can we share that, right? Is that something that hearing people will take for their own benefit? So really, I feel that in the aspect of interpreting, this is extremely important. And all of your comments really caused me to think and wanted me really to ask this question, where during the course of a performance, is that all right to be recorded? Would any of you all agree to that?
Sure.
Well, sure, Daniel, I think that you might agree, but I think that you see everyone else's reaction is, right, some concern of being in front of a camera, right? So I can imagine that hearing folks might feel the same in front of a camera, right? Where not everyone is going to jump right into that role, right? And it's the same as hearing people, right? They might not necessarily as easily jump into that role as well. Where instead of feeling the need to just go for it, right? Maybe they have feelings of embarrassment.
I certainly agree, but one thing to consider is, in terms of being what's accepted and what is offered to the deaf community. And what we want to think about is offering a high quality of service to the deaf community. And so, interpreters that may opt to do some sort of light casework interpreting, maybe it's just, light medical work, low risk situations. But as time progresses, they may build those skills as they've accumulated that experience over time. And that would then affect their ability to utilize facial expression. Talking about interpreting on the news or interpreting in front of an audience, how can you do that without utilizing facial expression?
Absolutely, and right, and that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about specifically, right? So I do some tutoring in a community college. I also do some tutoring with some Native American interpreters. I've done interpreting with federal level interpreters. So really, I've seen various different scenarios. So I'm thinking of exactly how we can support. And I think that the most important thing is to be prosody,
Yeah, not familiar with that.
Right. So when we say prosody, we think about the rhythm, we think of the tempo, we think of the intonation being used.
It's like artistic, okay?
In linguistics, they might call it stress. So that was actually a part of my own study, where we talked about different countries and how they differ, as well as how they're similar with their extent. So what's really surprising is the fact that Japanese folks actually have a good amount of facial expression.
Very interesting.
Was this an interpreting or the deaf users?
Deaf users. in Japan. In Mexico, their language users are known to be less expressive, and that's actually something that requires additional parsing, right? Even in their
Very interesting.
even in their use of sign language, right? It requires a little bit more parsing, like I said. So also in other
Urbanized.
urbanites, thank you very much. In other native communities, absolutely, you can see the difference in their production, and it's absolutely fascinating, the difference. Daniel, do you want to say something?
If I can comment, yeah, that's very interesting. So one deaf teacher themselves who was here in America and taught at university went to Japan and reached out to me and called me over to see if I, or rather asked me if I would be willing to present via Zoom. And most of the deaf there really lacked facial expression. And the reason for that is, they were just embarrassed. And Japan is an island, right? It's just a solitary island, and the culture there is not very accepting of facial expression. And so they called me in to teach that specifically. And also my personal experience just through friends, etc., with Japan and China and various countries in Asia is that they often lack facial expression. But you mentioned that you have research that indicates the opposite. So I'm excited to see that.
Yep, that's a really good point. And as a part of my studies, we did reporting of different folks as part of their lecture series, part of their production. But again, you can see the difference, right, in Japan and their use of facial expression. It's really, really interesting.
Are we speaking deaf or hearing individuals?
No, deaf individuals. My focus is entirely on deaf individuals.
Perhaps older individuals.
But it was interesting, right? Just again, finding those similarities and those differences, but it requires additional study. Unfortunately, there are not many folks who have studied those urbanite populations.
Can you spell that again? What was that word?
Prosody.
Prosody, okay.
Mm-hmm. So again, when I say prosody, I'm talking about rhythm, right? In the case of writing, right, it has its own cadence, its own pace, right? In spoken language, you have that intonation, you have the various inflections. In the case of ASL language users, right, you have that full body inclusion in that communication. The head, the body, again, the way that it's included in their syntax, in their phonology,
right?
It's well as their semantics, right? It's fully incorporating the body in that communication. So, in ASL, we're familiar with the 5 different parameters. I think we should add on facial expression on that list.
So there's one question from our viewers. They're wondering if this will be, or if that will go out soon and that research will be available.
Indeed it will. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much, Linguabee.
Thank you.
All right, we have 2 raised hands, so I'm going to go ahead and call Claudia on if she wants to ask her question.
I do have something to add. Perhaps I'll add it later.
Claudia, if you want to turn your video on. Oh, we're getting her in. Okay.
Hello, Claudia.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us all here today. I am an ASL specialist, and so that's something I've been doing for about the last year. And as you guys have been talking about facial expressions, you've given some really good examples. And of course, it's something that we already have internally and intrinsically. But I think we have to consider mainstream students who aren't educated in a deaf area. If they don't have deaf teachers and who are using those expressions, if there are sign language interpreters who are hearing aren't using those expressions, if the paraprofessionals aren't using them, that's going to have a huge impact on those deaf children's language developing without expressions, even though they're deaf. So that's something I've seen come up. And once they get exposed to this richer language with all of those, their understanding and their comprehension expands profoundly. I think that that's something we're definitely seeing, is that those students being educated by hearing teachers who may be signers aren't teaching them those language pieces.
So if I may, sorry that I'm interrupting, but without failing, or excuse me, without facial expression, right? They're going to fail. They're going to be frustrated, right? We have to just, it has to be an automatic part of the process. It has to, like,
Absolutely.
from day one. That's a minimum. For example, if I'm a doctor, right, and I am making mistakes, I have administered the wrong medication or the wrong shot, I mean, my certification, my credentials are out the door.
But how? These are working credentialed professionals that are already there, already working. They've passed their certifications, they're tested, and they're out there allowed to work.
Well, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf has a responsibility, I mean, to manage or to monitor, right? I don't know. Do they have those rules?
Well,
so I know it's having a huge impact on the student, but there's only so much time that we have. And Bucky is stating, yes, I think that's something RID does have a strong emphasis on the physical production of signing in their certification test. I wonder if this is something that could be considered in interpreter certification evaluation.
It
Well,
has to.
if not already.
Claudia is reminding, yeah, we need to tell them. We need to make sure that they consider that.
So if I can offer an example, for individuals who are speaking, if they turned off their voice and all they're doing is mouthing the words, no one's going to know what they're saying, right? It's going to be an approximation. That would be so difficult to determine what it is that they're meaning. Business and productivity all over would crash. So, you think about community in general, everything would just not foster, and to eliminate facial expression in sign would have the same effect.
And I know that we're looking for an immediate solution, but maybe we can focus a little bit more on just simple signing practice. Right? Folks, might be prompted for that practice and they might not think that anything is wrong, but it's so necessary, right? I can see it helping.
We have to, as deaf people, continue to demonstrate this. We don't have to hide our facial expressions, but we also have to turn our voices off. We can't let them be using that as a crutch. When I've done that, I've seen hearing people communicating with me, improving their comprehension of my signing. So it shouldn't matter. When I tell deaf and hard of hearing people and try and spread the word that we have to quit giving a crutch to those people of using our voice. And Bucky's asking, I think there's another way we can also try and think about this of how can we communicate this to the interpreters to ensure that they're fully comprehending the critical nature of these facial expressions? How do we deliver that information? I don't know, but that's kind of where my brain is and what I'm trying to think about, is convincing them that this is actually important, because then they'll actually go out and want training and seek it instead of us trying to pull them in.
So how to encourage interpreters? You have to look at agencies, you have to look at interpreters individually. And to recruit them and bring them in, you need to offer the training and offer the support. And then it will happen organically. You've got to push interpreters to want to do it. I don't know.
Also to set that standard.
Taking a look at the screening process. If an interpreter doesn't indicate that they have the skill to utilize facial expressions, perhaps they shouldn't be passing screenings.
Absolutely.
Right? This is how deaf individuals operate. What's more important? Are we looking at deaf individuals and their community and their health as a community? Or are we looking at the money that can potentially be made from interpreters?
I was thrilled. My boss actually is not deaf, but is hearing and blind. And they got kind of caught in this because they couldn't see the interpreter signing. They couldn't oversee this process, and came to me and wanted to have a discussion. And they wanted information on classifiers, such as how to show a desk and how to use this information. So that led to the interpreters using some more of those because it was used. And so it was just a matter of them practicing utilizing the classifiers in those ways. But I want that to be something that is all over. I can't just do that in my own workplace. I think that there's something we need to be able to partner and try and get this to be a more concerted effort, so that it's not just groups talking about how do we do this in theory in separate siloed places, whether it's ASL or the ASLTA groups and credentialing organizations. We should all be talking about this in a concerted effort. But thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia.
What was your sign name, Claudia? How do you sign your name? Okay.
Claudia.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you all as well. Bucky's mentioning, I saw somebody else, Michael, I think, had their hand up previously, but then lowered it. Okay, the hand is up now, so we'll call Michael McMahon onto the call. Should be able to pull your video up soon. Hi, everybody. All right, so this is
Hello.
Michael. Yes,
This
my
is
name is
Michael
Michael
McMahon.
McMahon.
Go ahead, mate.
Yep, I'm Michael McMahon, and I'm a deaf interpreter. And I think this is an excellent discussion. I think one of the things that is really important, though, is to consider the use of deaf interpreters. Some areas we don't have enough, but there are lots of urban areas that we do have deaf interpreters that can work full time. And so why are they not being utilized to demonstrate these facial expressions and to model this for their hearing teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. So speaking in terms of deaf interpreters, let's say, for example, a hearing interpreter is offering that feed to a deaf interpreter. We still have to think of, and I want to say that you are right. Sometimes, however, you have a certified deaf interpreter, maybe they're not available or they can't be there. Maybe there's a last minute situation. And so the question is, do you need the hearing interpreter to always be reliant on a deaf interpreter?
Well, but they're out there, they're available, and there's just not being demonstrated the need and the work demand and load for them to be out there. There are plenty of interpreters who need that employment and have the opportunity to have the skills. So why are they not being utilized? And that's a perfect opportunity for those hearing teams to learn and to develop those skills. You're right. When I'm being fed by a hearing interpreter and produce a equivalent language model in a different way and deconstruct the meaning, it's typically shocking to the hearing interpreter to see how it's done. And there are plenty of hearing interpreters out there working, but deaf interpreters aren't doing that, aren't getting the same opportunity. They think hearing interpreters don't think that they necessarily need that type of support. They get a job and don't know if they're not the best fit. And so then they're not going to be the best fit. They're going to show up to the job, but they're not going to have any support to improve their skills at the same time.
Oh, that's happening. Go ahead, Andrea. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think absolutely we need to include deaf interpreters more in the workload, but at the same time, we don't have enough deaf interpreters. So really, what it seems like is hearing interpreters are just filling in that gap. And really, there's no equivalent having hearing interpreters. There's no equivalent having hearing interpreters as having a deaf interpreter. But by the same token, we do have to recognize that some deaf interpreters aren't able to find work because hearing interpreters are stepping into those roles. So how can we improve the overall situation where deaf interpreters are being assigned those roles, but at the same time, hearing interpreters have that addition to their own work?
Right, but we have those resources available and they just have to be utilized. Whether that's providing workshops or going to different places, why aren't they using this as an available resource?
I agree.
Yeah, there's no disagreement there for me, Michael, for sure.
And Bucky's stating, yes, I think that's a huge part of the responsibility of the agency to acknowledge the need for a deaf interpreter and a hearing interpreter. And hearing interpreters have said that too, that there's some companies where the consumers are, or the paying entity is frustrated because they don't want to pay for two interpreters, and the company, the language service agency, really has to push on that. They have to have it from the interpreters, from the language service agency, and the deaf consumer to demonstrate that actual need.
Right. And I think that just shows that there's really just not a single solution, right? There's many different barriers to placing a deaf interpreter. Like hearing interpreters can serve as gatekeepers, right? They can decide who shows up to those jobs or not, and whose facial expression shows up on those jobs or not. So I think that additionally, we need to really just push discussions on interpreting standards in the field. I think that I don't see enough of them and we need more.
Yes, I also wanted to add, when we talk about ASL as a language and working between ASL and English, whether we're trying to do that simultaneously or consecutively, a lot of interpreters think that they can work from English into ASL simultaneously, but they're going to default to their native language and to their auditory input because it's going to take less energy for them. So we have to push to use more consecutive language, and would that potentially give them more processing and ability to integrate those skills if they do have them and aren't able to use them in a simultaneous mode?
You know, I never thought about that.
They would have more opportunity to think about how to represent that language.
They get the entire message and can truly process it before they try and produce it in a second language and miss part of that critical information.
You know, in the news, we are seeing an increasing number of CDIs, and I'm personally very excited for that. You know, that same fluidity that we see on screen from the CDI, that's so incredibly important. And you could see it happening in consecutive fashion, right? I think there's definitely a benefit to that.
This is Bucky saying that I think that when we're having this conversation about how to improve facial expression in interpreters, I think it's right. We still have to have access to CDIs, though. Of course, we wish there were more, and that's something that's not the fault of the CDI. We have to create job opportunities for them because there just aren't enough out there nationwide at this point. So as we use them more, that creates more opportunities for them, because when deaf are using that native part of their language of visual facial expressions, like Daniel's been talking about this entire time, they're going to be utilized more because it's a more accurate representation.
You know, and on top of that, with the increased use of CDI, we also have an increased level of acceptance, right? Which means that agencies and other trendsetters will follow that new standard and change will follow.
And also to think about interpreters improving their use of facial expressions. With CDIs, you know, it's much easier when I watch them as opposed to interpreters, hearing interpreters that are often missing things. With CDIs, the interpreted message comes across much better. It's just a more robust representation, you know. And also, if you have a hearing interpreter who is very good and using facial representation, that will make it easier for the CDI to create a quality product as well. The better the hearing, the better the deaf.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your question.
Thank you. All right, this is Bucky saying, I think we have time for one more question, maybe, or there are more.
Yeah.
Any more? We do have a little bit of time, but we don't have anybody waiting.
Maybe they're embarrassed to use their facial expression on camera.
I mean, that's all right. They can go ahead and use the chat. If they have a question, submit it through the Q&A maybe. Really, I feel that the three participants that we had brought up excellent points. And I think that we had a great discussion on this topic. And hopefully we can have a greater discussion in the rest of the world.
Yeah, we do have one question in the chat, but it's a pretty quick answer. It says, will this recording be sent out to the registrants? And the answer is yes. We typically record these and then we post it on YouTube. So we can send it out as an announcement on our Facebook. It goes on our Instagram. We typically post there, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and it will be put there. Anytime we put a new video on there, if you're subscribed, it will give you an alert. All right, well, I think with that, do we have any final comments, Daniel? This is the floor, it's yours. Any last nuggets you think you need to impart to us?
Yeah. You know, you think about sitting water, right? And as it's moving there, and if you're in that water, right, you might dip your feet in and you might feel like it's a little bit cold and you might be hesitant, or you might go the opposite direction. But what I'm saying is jump in, get right in there, just dive right in and immerse yourself in this culture, in this profession, in these skills. We are all one collective family. And, you know, as far as facial expressions are concerned, you will get better. You'll get more work, you'll be happier, you'll feel like, you're offering a more robust message. You will give better access. You'll just feel the love. It'll be better for everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Don't be afraid. Jump in, give it a try, fail and get right back up. We're all in the same place.
Yes, Daniel. Thank you so much for your contribution to this wonderful discussion tonight. And I hope that everybody at home watching feels ready to practice all their facial expression in the moment.
Thank
Get crazy
you.
with it. All right. Thank you again. And everybody have a good night.